Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 311. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have back with us the internationally acclaimed and science fiction comic book author and now ancient stone mystery historian, Mike Luoma.
Hey, Barney.
Mike,
How are you?
good. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Right.
Things are going really well. So,
I know. You are a prolific sci-fi author. As of the last few years, you really kind of got a deep dive in, and you're kind of hinting about it last time you were on the show a couple of years ago, about really studying curiosities that you noticed in the woods that just kind of built up into doing some significant study on New England stone mysteries.
yeah, I started going off to check out stone chambers originally
Hmm.
because I was like, "What? There are stone chambers in the woods? What's going on?" I don't know. After a fascination with that and watching shows like America Unearthed and some of these things talking about like European explorers coming here before Columbus,
Hmm.
maybe they built the stone chambers. I decided I was going to start checking them out. And as I did that, as I actually experienced the stone chambers, my whole opinion of what they were changed.
Okay.
I didn't think so much it was as Europeans that were here before Columbus, but rather I got this strong, like, intuitive sense it was actually indigenous work. When I was in the Upton Stone Chamber in Upton, Massachusetts, I checked that out, and it's a really cool chamber because it has a long entryway, and then inside it opens up into this big dome chamber.
Okay.
It's all built of stone. It's actually on my ancient stone mystery site. It's the chamber that's on the cover of the book and on the picture in the background. You go in it, it it's just really, I don't know, it's surprising how dark it is in there, and it's got a core-built ceiling, so the stones kind of build up, and then it's capped off by a single stone. And after standing in there and kind of wondering who built it, I got this intuitive sense that this was indigenous work that went a long way back.
Right.
So I started asking questions and posting pictures, and as I did that, people were like, "You've got to read this book, Manitou." It was written
Okay.
in 1989 by these two guys, James Maver and Byron Dix. They basically talked about the fact that they thought a lot of New England's older stonework, the stuff we see in our woods, dated back to indigenous times. So it
Wow.
was actually built by the earlier indigenous people.
Right.
That was a whole new concept to me. But they were talking about like a stone chamber down in South Royalton, Vermont, called Calendar One, that they called Calendar One because they felt that the valley it was in was kind of a celestial calendar. Different stuff that was on the different peaks around this valley could be used to tell the different seasons based on what was rising on the horizon for stars, and the sun and moon and their placement as the years and the year went along, things like that. So they found these alignments, and then they went down to the Upton Stone Chamber and actually found they felt there were alignments from that chamber to a nearby ridge called Pratt Hill that had stone elements that were built on top of it. And they felt because of the stars and the alignments they found that it was a chamber for viewing the stars that went back well into antiquity.
Hmm.
So these guys who created Manitou changed kind of the viewpoint of a lot of people who had been thinking this was earlier European work pre Columbus.
Right.
And it was really wild for me to read that book because as I was reading about these places, I was getting invited to see the chambers that they were writing about.
Wow.
It would sync up. And then there was this really wild coincidence as I was reading it at my mom's house. This was like during the pandemic in 2020, like we were getting into that early summer. I'm reading Manitou, and it's talking about a 4,000-year-old indigenous stone wall was found in the Flag Swamp in Marlborough, Massachusetts.
Huh.
Now, That is about a mile from where I grew up. So I was reading about that about a mile from where it existed. And what's even crazier is that they discovered this in the late 70s, but in 1980 they blew it up to make way for a highway access road.
Oh man.
The oldest stone structure ever found in Massachusetts was a 4,000-year-old indigenous stone wall about a mile from where I grew up, and they blew it up. It's like there's no respect for indigenous stonework in Massachusetts, and it's not really acknowledged by some of the different state archaeologists around New England. Some have come along, but others just don't see it. And um, there's actually an archaeologist named Curtis Hoffman who wrote a really great study and put it out in 2018. It's called Stone Prayers, and it looked into the fact that a lot of this stonework, instead of being what was assumed to be colonial or assumed to be later sheep farmers' work, it actually, like I say, predated contact and was indigenous stonework built by earlier indigenous people, the ancestors of those we know today.
As the author of this book, are you asking questions or are you providing answers?
Well, I wanted to write a book that was a good introduction to these ideas.
Okay.
And I didn't want to write something that I felt was exploitive of indigenous peoples because they've had a lot of exploitation already.
Right.
So I thought what I should do is tell my story of discovering what might be going on here and
Right.
how it might be indigenous work. So it's really me talking about the places that I visited and the experiences I had there, and also the research I did and what I discovered as I was going to each site. And then as you get later in the book, I start to share some of the ideas that I've developed as I've been seeing things over time.
Right.
Because I started to see, I've got a lot of like unique things going on in my head, as I guess we all do. But as far as like art and design, I've got a real sense of spatial relationships. I also spent a couple of years as a mason tender, working my way through college, helping build like industrial size warehouses and like big block masonry.
Right.
And it's just kind of weird how some of these different aspects have informed what I'm doing now and looking at stonework. And what some people had written off as like clearing piles or just farmers pushing stones to the sides of their fields, not real stonework. I can actually see repeated designs that they're not just in one place. They're repeated all over New England and indicative of earlier indigenous work. And it's just that some of these people who were in the field earlier just couldn't distinguish the fact that this was actually work and actually by design and not some falling down stone wall.
Why is that? Why do you feel as though like mainstream historians don't look at these stoneworks in that same way?
Well, I was talking about Curtis Hoffman and
Right.
Stone Prayers, and in that Curtis actually faults his fellow academics. He's a now retired archaeologist from Bridgewater State or University of Bridgewater in Massachusetts, and part of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. He used to edit their bulletin. And after discovering that these seemed to be indeed stone prayers, he faulted his colleagues for not acknowledging the fact that they are, and even points out that now the United Southern and Eastern tribes have come forth and said that yes, this is the work of their ancestors. These are stone prayers. These are ceremonial stone landscapes. Um, but the failure to acknowledge this, he calls scientism, and
Mm.
stems from like this dogmatic refusal to want to acknowledge that amateurs like myself, or not myself necessarily, but people like me who came before me, came up with these ideas and presented them. People like Maver and Dix,
Mm.
um, they don't want to admit that these guys had a valid idea because they don't like the source. Um, Maver and Dix were part of a group called the New England Antiquities Research Association, NERA, and I'm now a part of that. I actually ended up From all I've been doing, I'm now on the board of NERA. At least for the time being, I just got nominated this year, and I've started doing a little bit more with the group. So,
Yeah.
but they don't. The academic crowd and the professional crowd don't like the fact that amateurs have come up with so much of this stuff.
And so, what are some of your theories then that you've been um, researching?
Well, it started with the idea that um, stone rows, some of these stone walls, especially like single stone rows, were older, and the chambers might be older.
Mm.
So I started, like I had said, with a fascination with the chambers, but over time began to see things in a broader sense. I also, as I would take pictures of stone rows and post them online, I was joining different groups on Facebook. I didn't have a group myself yet, but I was joining groups and posting what I was finding and getting feedback. There's a group on there called the Ceremonial Stone Landscapes of Turtle Island, and it's started by this, or at least run by this guy, Tim McSweeney. He's one of the people that's been doing this for a long time, since like the early 90s. He has a blog called Waking Up on Turtle Island,
Huh.
which is quite good. And he's been really, as far as like somebody I could learn from. I disagree with him, and we don't always get along, but he's taught me a whole lot, and really first opened my eyes to what could be in the stone rows. Because what he'll do is, if you post stuff online, he'll take the pictures and sometimes add antlers and eyes, so you can see what it would look like if it was an actual effigy form, and then you begin to see it as an actual effigy form, and
Mm.
you begin to see how there could be serpent forms in the stone rows, and you see the designs, or I began to see the design work that were in the stone rows, and noticing that there are sometimes like rhomboidal stones that are surrounded by other stones to form like eyes, or links, or coils. And often these serpent rows zigzag across the landscape. Sometimes they undulate, they go up and they go down. And so those are just some of the things I began to see. Some of them end in these like large stones, so it's like a boulder-sized serpent head.
Okay.
And what's funny is that a lot of this has been done down in Massachusetts, but because that was kind of like where it started, and a lot of the chambers are down in southern Vermont and Putnam County, New York. There's chambers in Massachusetts, but not so much up here. Although I did get to see one stone chamber in northern Vermont, whose location I can't reveal because I was sworn to secrecy about it. So that was a chamber that Joe Citro told me about.
Right. Yeah.
You're familiar with Joe,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah. So if he swears you to secrecy, you don't want to go back on that.
Yeah. Exactly. and
But
then,
that was a
so what?
tunnel chamber, so it was really
Yeah.
cool because you could walk up and through it, and it was huge stones and just very impressive.
What is the reason from based off of the historical like which First Nation cultures were around in southern Vermont and Massachusetts that it wasn't prevalent in say towards Canada and then northern Vermont.
What I'm finding is that it's here.
Hmm.
See, that's part of the reason that I'm
Okay.
doing the research I'm doing, is that, I there. I mean, no offense, but the Vermont public people, they have their Vermont podcasts and
Yeah.
things, and they had a podcast about where did Vermont stone walls come from,
Yeah.
and not only did they ignore any indigenous origin to them, they said, "Oh, indigenous people did stonework, but not like this." So I'm not sure what kind of stonework they were supposed to have done,
Right.
but they also said that there are no stone walls in the Champlain Valley because of the way the glaciers came through,
Right.
and they didn't leave the material for stone wall building here in the Champlain Valley. But like the assumption that these were stone walls built by sheep farmers or stone
Right.
walls built by colonial people. That's not true. I can show you pictures, and you were showing some of my pictures of stone walls in the Champlain Valley.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I often find them in places where stone prayers are said to originate. Those who are doing the work, like there's an indigenous archaeologist anthropologist named Noam Kashat Schilling, and he's got papers that describe like where these stone prayers often occur, and it's in places where the landscape changes, where bedrock breaks through and water breaks through. And a lot of times, the stone prayers are oriented around water of some kind,
Right.
and so what I started to do is look for those places in Vermont where that was true, and began to find it up here around the Champlain Valley, and it's often at a height where the Champlain Sea used to reach. Before we had a Lake Champlain, at the end of the Ice Age, there was an actual saltwater sea in the Champlain Valley that went up around Labrador and reached the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
And there were Paleo Indians living on that sea. And eventually it receded because after the Ice Age and the ice sheets went away, the Earth's crust rebounded. It rose up.
Right.
So that these days, the places that were at the shoreline of the Champlain Sea and at sea level are now like 400 and some odd feet above sea level and higher.
Right.
And
Huh.
when I started looking at that height around the Champlain Valley, that's when I started to find the most stuff as
Wow.
far as the stonework. And so I'm not, I mean, I kind of speculate that it might go back to the Stone Age. I mean, to the Ice Age.
Right.
Some of this work could be like ancestor worship that was kept up over time, but it's really it's kind of a strange thing. But around the Champlain Valley, I'm finding stonework similar to what they were finding in Massachusetts and southern Vermont now up here,
Right.
and it's not always that well known. Like I've gotten lucky in that the people whose work I was reading, like Tim McSweeney's, and there's another guy who has a great blog called Rock Piles, and that's a guy named Peter Waxman who did a lot of work out of Concord, Massachusetts. Then there's a guy who is based out of I think Pennsylvania or New Jersey, Norm Muller, who
Hmm.
did a lot of work. Even in Vermont, he's done work, and um, all of these guys I like learned from, and now I'm in touch with like via email and like there was a site in Jericho, Vermont that I came across that I was like, wow, look at this. And there wasn't anything in the archives of Nera, which I looked for. And because I know Norm and he's looked at some of the stuff up here in Vermont, I asked him if he knew of this stuff in Jericho. And he sent me notes from having visited it in 2010. So it was great. I mean, the people that I learned from, I'm now corresponding with, and well, I'm still
Right.
learning.
Right.
But because it's such a specialized field, there's not a lot of people, and it's kind of an honor to have them engage with me the way they do.
Right. Now, so for those that might be uh, just like the a lay person who might not know what to look for, because you have a lot of people here in Vermont that love to go, as we were saying, like to go out in the woods. Um, if someone wants to start looking for these, how can they tell a difference between this and these rock structures and a sheep farmer's wall?
Well, one thing to look for
Yeah.
is irregular coursework. Like
Okay.
coursework, by coursework I mean like a row of stones. And generally, with an indigenous work, you find it's only about one stone row thick, maybe two sometimes, but
Okay.
mostly they're the single stone rows. And their coursework tends to go up and down and move in creative ways and be like almost forming different shapes as opposed to like the 1/2 structure, kind of the brick like stonework that you'll
Okay.
see in a typical European wall.
Right.
European walls generally are much more regular in their structure. You will sometimes see a European wall end in a boulder because they'll use that to stop the coursework. So then you need to look at the coursework itself and see if there are any forms and shapes that are being constructed or if it's just very regular.
Right.
Usually European walls are very nicely built, very straight, and if there's coping on top, it's very straight. Whereas an indigenous wall often will have a very curvy top
Right.
because, like I say, it's more of an organic structure to the coursework as opposed to that 1/2. But
Right.
that's just for stone rows. You often see like what in Europe they call cairns.
Right.
Those cairns in New England are said now to be likely indigenous work, especially ones that aren't, you know, carefully made, that aren't, I don't want to say carefully made. Of course, they're carefully made. They're even more carefully made because they have like diving coursework, and they're built to have like um, effigy forms. Some of them are built to represent turtles, or built to represent other forms that we don't know. I mean, we guess at turtles, we guess at serpents. We do that because the imagery and the designs that we're seeing seem to correspond to indigenous artwork
Right.
and the work that has been done, like what great serpents have been depicted like throughout North America, what we now call North America. So it's a case of trying to compare what we're seeing with what's come before and making correlations.
Right.
And it's like, okay, well, why do these look this way? Well, perhaps it's because it resembles this, and so then we say it's a serpent or a turtle
Mm.
or something like that. And sometimes you'll see that a stone row will have where one serpent ends and goes into another, or they'll meet, or one will have like an egg shape in its mouth that turns into the tail of another serpent. They're very creatively made, and I think having done design work, having done all the comic books and the layout and the stuff I've done previously, kind of led into me being able to see that work myself. And as I said, being shown, by previous researchers, hey, this is what I'm seeing when I'm talking about effigies and stonework. I put antlers on and eyes so you can see it. That informed my, that kind of was like a open my eyes thing. I talk about it like, what is that movie, Them, where you put on the glasses and you can see the aliens?
Yeah.
That's kind of what it's like. Once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. You just start to
Right.
see it everywhere because you start to realize how to interpret what you're seeing.
Right.
And suddenly these don't look like European stone walls anymore, and you can see the European ones, and
Right.
there's more of a regularity.
Because you have a great passion behind this now. So did you write this book for you, or did you write this to really expand the public knowledge of this?
Well, I wanted to expand the public knowledge as much as I could. I mean, I started a Facebook group, Ancient Stone Mysteries of New England, in December 2020.
Hmm.
And now there are 13,300 people that are members of
Wow.
the group. So I'm doing what I can there. And now, like, Tim McSweeney posts stuff in my group, which is awesome. And I've got other people who are doing this kind of research who also publish in the group and post their finds in the group. So it's a great community where people are sharing the stonework they find and interpreting it and offering ideas. But I also know there's people that don't go on Facebook and don't go online and want a
Right.
book. And so I thought telling the story of the places I was seeing and what I was learning in book form, kind of working off of articles I've been putting out, the posts I've been writing, pulling it together and making it into more of a book, and sharing like over 500 black and white photos too. In the course of the book, there's a lot of pictures. I tried to share this journey so that people can make it themselves.
Right. That's amazing. 13,000 people in that Facebook group.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
well, it's Facebook, so the algorithm doesn't let you reach all those people all the time.
right.
But it is, yeah, and not everybody posts. There's a lot of people who just lurk, but there are people who are posting, who read Manitou, who read Curtis Hoffman's Stone Prayers and start sharing sites. And Curtis actually, for Stone Prayers, at the time he put it out in 2018, he had assembled a database of something like 700 sites. And I know it's like at some astronomically higher number now because he continues to ask for and receive reports of stone sites. So once
Wow.
I started seeing this stuff, I started reporting to Curtis and letting him know what I was seeing.
Right.
And I actually got the chance to work on a research trip with him last October, so just about a year ago,
Mm.
which was very cool. So it's really fun to get into this work and have people that are into it respond enthusiastically to what I'm doing and be very encouraging.
So yeah, so definitely folks that are interested, take checking going on that state, as you mentioned, Ancient Stone Mysteries of New England, that Facebook group. There's probably close to thousands of videos and photos that are on here now. Also, the New England Antiquities Research Association. So they're also having at this recording, there is a fall conference that's happening in Marlborough, Mass on November 10th to the 12th as well.
Yes, that's going to be the fall conference for NEAR. They do two each year, one in the spring, one in the fall.
Okay.
And I'm actually going to be leading a field trip as part of the conference to one of the sites in Massachusetts that I've investigated
Wow.
around Gates Pond, where it has King Philip's Rock and a few other possible stone prayers, one of which I actually reported to Curtis Hoffman. It was like the first site that I ever reported.
Wow. Okay.
So I'm part of that conference in some way.
And then in Vermont, how many Vermont members are part of NERA then?
There are I don't know the number offhand. I don't want to
Right.
act like I've got it under top of my head here, but there's probably 15, 20 maybe.
Okay. All right.
There's
Yeah.
a guy in southern Vermont, Josh Smart, who's doing a lot of work around the Mount Escutney area,
Mm.
and he's got, I think it's Mysterious Mountains YouTube channel. Now, see,
Okay.
that's another thing I actually haven't touched on yet is I started doing videos as part of this. So I have a whole YouTube channel now with, um, I think over 100 videos on this stuff, well over.
Right.
And so there's an Ancient Stone Mysteries of New England YouTube channel, and what I wanted to do is share my experiences of sites, but I'm not in my videos. I figure that people don't want to see me; they want to see the stonework. So
Oh,
I'll go to a site, and as I take it in, I video, I record it, and then I put together these videos, and I narrate them after the fact, and that's why I started doing a lot of the writing and the research on the sites is to
okay.
narrate the videos more accurately and to share information that I was discovering.
Right.
So each of these things has kind of fed into the other, you know.
How do you prioritize your research and your passion for this to other things that you got to do on a day to day basis?
Well, as I can. It's, I generally don't, as far as time management goes, I just try to make it work as
Right.
opposed to worry too much about day to day stuff.
Right.
Um, and what I've found in doing this work is that things seem to happen when they need to happen.
Okay.
I've been kind of lucky that way. But also, I work for WBKM.org, and sometimes I can just say, look, I'm going to need a couple days here to do this or that. And it's
Right.
usually not a problem to get the time.
Right. Yeah.
And so, there's that accommodation that happens. I also don't have kids. So my books are my kids. But I also haven't been writing as much fiction. I've been mostly focused on this as opposed to doing the fiction. And I haven't really been doing any comic book work because this has been really what's been calling me.
Right. Yeah.
So the time I spent, and I used to, focus a lot on those, The time I would have spent on those, I'm now doing more research and reading and getting out in the field.
Right.
And I'm discovering things that I haven't touched on yet that I think could be even more remarkable than the smaller stone prayers.
Okay.
Because I think there's stuff that goes back to the Ice Age that could be monumental, even here in Vermont.
Mm.
Like entire ridges that may have been adapted into looking like a great serpent. And a small mountain on Lake Champlain that looks like it was deliberately stratified and adapted with stones turned to make it look like gills or something. But it's it's in the book. I do start to talk about it in the book, but it's still very preliminary as far as what I'm looking into.
Wow.
And it's radical to suggest this stuff could go back that far.
Right.
But again, I started with the idea it went back that far because of its location above the shoreline of those ancient glacial seas or
Right.
post glacial seas.
Yeah. I mean, so the things that you're discovering were ancient, basically 2,000 years ago. Then.
Oh, I'm thinking they
Yeah.
were indeed, you
Right.
know, probably 12,000 years old
Right.
or slightly newer,
Right.
11,000 years old.
Right.
We didn't think they were, when I first came to Vermont, it was the early 80s, and people told me, oh, Indians never lived in Vermont, Mike. Uh, which, is stunning. And it's never been true.
Right.
It's always been provably wrong
Right.
because there's always been, all kinds of evidence that indigenous people were here. But in
Right.
the 90s, especially, they began to discover that, there was continuous habitation just about from the time of the Ice Age until now, because they're still here
Right.
and, didn't go anywhere but had to go undercover when, like in the early 20th century, people were trying to sterilize indigenous women because they thought they were inferior with
Right.
eugenics. So,
Yeah.
yeah, they're still here. I don't want
Yeah.
to make it sound like this is the just in the ancient past. But in
Right.
the 90s, that's when we discovered that there were Paleo Indians living on the shores of the Champlain Sea. And I just watched a presentation by Jess Robinson, who's the Vermont state archaeologist, and he's done a lot of work about how they traveled and what they used for stone points and things. And he's discovered that they had a maritime aspect to their culture. Um, this is something that Vermont archaeologists have been writing about since the 90s anyway, because there's a book called The Original Vermonters by Haviland and Powers, who were Vermont University of Vermont professors
Mm.
in archaeology and anthropology, and they wrote about the continuing presence and this maritime connection as well. But just recently, Jess Robinson was talking about it and how they lived on the sea, and it's interesting to know that people have been here all that time. And what it starts to, I don't know, it says to me that we've been here what 600 years, tops. Um, these people were here for 10,000 years plus, 11,000, 12,000, 13,000 years.
Right.
Connecticut Valley, Champlain Valley.
Yeah.
I think they might have done things to the landscape.
Yeah.
It's just a thought.
Yeah.
So, so I, the thing about being an amateur doing this is I'm not constricted by having to be respectable and stay within academic bounds, and I can engage in wild speculation. But I do find things that to me suggest that this stuff could go back to the Ice Age and could have been on the shores of the Champlain Sea. Or before that, there was a freshwater lake all across the Champlain Valley called Lake Vermont.
Yeah.
And in those days, the the Great Lakes were also mostly like one giant lake called Lake Iroquois.
Uh-huh.
And there could have been a migration from the west to the east via the waterways as the
Uh-huh.
Ice Age ended that brought people here, while there was also a land based migration. And those people could have come back together when the Champlain Sea disappeared because the Champlain Valley became almost uninhabitable when that happened. When the sea disappeared, it was like I know Haviland and Power said it could have been like in 10 years. It went from being a salt lake to being to receding and being just like brackish, plain fresh water.
Right.
So the entire ecosystem would have been just like shocked,
Right.
and it all changed from different trees to different fauna. It was when things came back to life around the Champlain Valley, when Lake Champlain began to be habitable,
Right.
then people showed up again. But there's like a gap where people aren't here. So I
Right.
think that maybe those different peoples left the Champlain Valley and mingled and became parts of other people.
So Mike, if people want to learn more about your book or people want to learn more about your other books, where's the best place they could go to?
For this book here, probably ancientstonemysteries.com.
Okay.
So that's a site that connects you. You can go to the Facebook page. There's a link to the YouTube site. There's a link to my Substack articles and my Medium articles,
Mm.
so that you can see some of the different things that I've tried to put out there to try to help let people know about what's happening or what could be happening. I do try to remain theoretical. I mean, these are hypotheses I'm putting out. These are theories that are being tested as
Yeah.
far as the stone prayers go. What's cool about the work that's been done before me is that I'm, standing on the shoulder of people that have done a lot of preliminary work. So I come in and now I can kind of make my contributions and maybe take things further, and
Right.
hopefully with the communication skills I've developed, I can spread the word about what might be out there and how it might be older than colonial and sheep farmers' work.
Right.
To get people thinking in these terms and realize that the way we've always thought about indigenous people too has been kind of closed-minded and very Eurocentric.
Right. And that's a good point too. Like so ancientstonemysteries.com, there's a link to your Facebook group, there's a link to your Medium articles, your Substack newsletter and the YouTube channel there. And you can get the book straight on there as well.
Yep. There are links to Lulu.com, which is my print on demand provider that I've used for all of my books over time. So
Right.
I went back to them because I decided to self publish this one. But you
Yeah.
can also get it anywhere paperbacks are available online. So
Yeah.
that's at bookshop.org or at Barnes and Noble or at Amazon.
Yeah.
I didn't I didn't say the big A first, but
Yeah.
yes, it's at all those places. I try to distribute to a lot more than just Amazon, um,
Perfect. Yeah.
so that people have the choice to do that. You can also go to glowinthedarkradio.com, which is my traditional site, and that has links
Yeah.
to everything too.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. This has been great. We get it's so fun chatting with you. It's so you always have such great, interesting stories.
Oh, well, thank you, man.
Yeah.
The time flies. I was like, really? It's time?
Yeah.
And I hope that I've described things about the stonework and about the possible nature of it, the
Right.
possible indigenous nature of it,
Yeah.
in ways that are understandable. Because I kind of get carried away, and
Yeah.
that's another reason I
No, you
wrote
did
the
a
book.
great.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so people can get it in maybe a more easy to digest for them, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. Perfect. Well, listen. So yeah, Mike, and come back on again. I mean, not don't come back on every like 200 episodes. You're gonna come back on sooner than that next time.
I'd be happy to. I'm starting to talk about things a lot more. I'm actually getting invited to do library talks about this book,
Oh,
which is
excellent.
awesome. I just lined up one for Sudbury for November down
Nice.
Massachusetts.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Thank you, Barney.
And we were just talking before we went live. Last time you were on the air, you had a beard as well. You had all kinds of. Did you have a beard? I think you had a
Yeah, I
beard.
had
Or,
beard, mustache. Yeah.
yeah. See. Yeah. And I think
You
what's
know that
because
kind of stuff gets tangled when you start going in the woods all the time. So
I see
you gotta
what's
watch
what
out
it
for that.
is. See, I mean, as a science fiction and a comic book writer, you had to have the nice beard and the long hair. But now you're an esteemed historian of an esteemed historian of mysteries of New England. You had, like you said, you're out in the woods a lot, so now you have to keep things trimmed up so you don't get twigs and stuff in your hair. I guess, right? So
You gotta, yeah, you gotta be careful.
yeah,
You don't want those ticks getting you either. I mean, out in
that's
the woods
true.
these